Hi everyone, it's Saul, and it has been quite a while since my last queer discussion video. Things have kind of been getting on top of me lately with streaming and other stuff, so I haven't really had much time to sit down and record or edit and so on and so forth. But that all changes today, because I am back. And as it's Pride Month, and in the spirit of moving towards a more diverse, accepting world, today I'd like to dispel a concept within the trans community that kinda rubs me the wrong way. As you may be able to tell from my outfit, I'm referring to the baby trans phase. The baby trans phase is the idea of a newly out trans person, particularly a trans woman, clumsily attempting to come to terms with gender expression and presentation in their new identity. While the concept itself is not necessarily unfounded, and newly out trans people often do need time to adjust to life in their affirmed gender, I personally find that the term is often used in quite a mean-spirited way by older trans people. And as it's Pride Month, I'd like to set that right. I came out as transgender in 2021, and up until that point I'd lived my life as a boy and then a man. I was one of many trans people who wasn't aware of my identity from a young age. I always knew that something never felt quite right about myself, but I didn't figure out what that was until adulthood. See my Trans Awakening video if you want to hear that story. So, for the first 22 years of my life, I'd never made any attempt to express my femininity. I didn't exactly exude masculinity either, I just wore anything that would fit and tried not to stand out too much. So to go from that to suddenly realising that I was a woman and I now had this newfound freedom to reinvent myself was a very exhilarating experience. I think a lot of trans people can attest to that kind of kid in a sweet shop mentality you have when you first come to terms with your identity, where suddenly you can do anything, be anything, the possibilities are endless, and you just want to go absolutely crazy, experimenting with makeup and clothes and everything else. It's a very exciting moment to feel that first taste of absolute freedom. But this is where the idea of the baby trans phase looms its ugly head. Something that both helped and hindered me in my early transition was the online trans community. I had a couple of IRL friends who were trans and non-binary, but like many trans people, I also sought solace in virtual queer spaces. And let me tell you, those can be both the best and worst places to be as a newly out trans person. Don't get me wrong, it's great to have a dedicated space to interact with people whose experiences are similar to your own, and there are plenty of great videos out there from trans content creators that can be a great help and comfort to recently out trans people. But, at least in my experience, some of the spaces I found myself in during my early transition seemed to have an air of cliquishness about them. I felt that there was a certain attitude some older trans women had towards recently out trans women such as myself, and that was reflected in the idea of the baby trans phase. I vividly remember watching a TikTok video quite early on in my transition, shortly after I'd started experimenting with more feminine clothing and makeup, by an older trans woman reflecting on her baby trans phase. And she mentioned that she looked back on that time and found it cringy and embarrassing, which is fine, I guess. It's okay to be embarrassed by your past self. But she then went on to imply that the baby trans phase itself was a cringy and embarrassing thing, and essentially encouraged trans people to grow up and get out of that phase as quickly as possible. Which felt very mean. And as a recently out trans person, it seriously knocked back my confidence. There I was trying to explore my gender expression for the very first time, and suddenly I was being made to feel that it was something to be ashamed of. And by a trans content creator, no less. It's one thing to look back on your own past with embarrassment, but to tell recently out trans people, you should be embarrassed, this is an embarrassing thing that you're doing right now, that's pretty awful. And what's worse is that, as a recently out trans person, you can't call it out because you're seen as being less knowledgeable and you should bow down to the experience of a trans elder. Well, I've been out for 5 years now. I've gained a lot more experience of life as a trans person. But instead of expecting younger trans people to bow down to that experience, I'm going to speak on their behalf. Because the idea of the baby trans phase still doesn't sit right with me. To me, at least, it feels like quite a nasty term that's often directed at newly out trans people with a kind of bitterness from older trans people because they've gotten past that initial rush of euphoria and settled down into the humdrum of everyday life as a trans person. And I get it. Once the dust settles and you've fully come to terms with your new identity, reality starts to set in. I'm not saying that I don't feel gender euphoria 5 years later, because I do. Every single day, but I also experience anxiety and stress at the reality of life as a trans person in a, frankly, deeply transphobic society. And I think a lot of older trans people look at those who are only recently out and feel a kind of resentment at seeing somebody experience an innocence and joy that they might not have felt for a long time. But joy is made to be shared. And rather than looking on with envy at younger trans people embracing their identity for the first time, we should celebrate them. I don't look back at my baby trans phase and think, God, that was embarrassing. I don't look at old pictures of myself and think, that makeup's terrible, or I wouldn't wear that today. I look back and I see a trans woman experiencing true gender euphoria for the first time in her life. I see a smile on my face that took 22 years to find. I see a level of confidence in myself that I would never have thought possible just a few months earlier. I don't feel ashamed of that at all. And I don't think any trans person should ever be made to feel ashamed of a time in their life where they were finally able to embrace their true identity for potentially the very first time. To any recently out trans people watching this video, never be ashamed of your baby trans phase. Don't be in such a hurry to grow out of it and become a sensible older trans person. Embrace it. Explore your identity unapologetically in a way that may have been denied to you for your entire life up to that point. And when you get to be an older trans person, please don't ever look back on that time in your life and feel ashamed. What you are doing is amazing, and powerful, and beautiful, and it should be celebrated, not ridiculed, especially not from within our own community. I mean, come on, it's Pride Month, a time to celebrate queer liberation, to uplift those exploring their gender or sexuality for the first time. Stand up and be proud of who you are. Find queer spaces that are truly diverse and welcoming, because they are out there. I know this video might come across as someone trying to stoke division between younger and older trans people, but really, I want the opposite. I want to bridge that gap, because I feel like older trans people sometimes forget that they were once in that position. That there was once a time where they'd only just come out and they needed those supportive voices from their elders. We're all on the same journey, even if we're all at different places on that journey. So let's help each other along, shall we? Let's have each other's backs. Thank you. Before I finish the video, I just want to thank you all for sticking around and continuing to support me despite the lack of video content over the last couple of months. I've been trying to branch out to as many different platforms as possible and probably overextended myself in a very short period of time. But you can now find me on Instagram for train-related content such as heritage railways and museum visits, Twitch and Kick for gaming live streams, which of course are also here on YouTube, Discord if you want to interact with my amazing community and keep up to date with what I'm working on, Patreon if you'd like to support me financially and occasionally get access to behind-the-scenes content, and also Blue Sky and Twitter if you just want general life updates and selfies and stuff. So that's it. That's all from me for today. I promise you there will be more videos coming very soon, and hopefully there'll be a noticeable shift towards longer videos going forward. Thank you everyone once again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.